Hello, everyone, and welcome to another DevOps.com webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today we have an interesting webinar with OpenMake and GitHub. They're going to be talking a little bit about the application package from GitHub repository called DeployHub. And they're going to show you exactly how to do it, how to deploy it, and get it done. On that note, let me introduce you to both Tracy from OpenMake and Christian from GitHub. Christian, are you there?
I am. Thank you.
You want to take over?
Yeah, I sure can. Thank you so much.
Okay. Chris, are you there, Christian?
I am. Are you? Are we ready?
We're ready. Take it from here.
All right. Thank you so much. So thank you, guys, for everyone that's joining on this webinar this afternoon. Just wanted to give you a quick introduction to myself. My name is Christian Weber. I'm a solutions architect at GitHub. I've been with GitHub for about 2.5 years now, and my previous experience, I spent the last 6 years prior to GitHub in financial services. I've done everything from release automation, release engineering, release management, to various levels of level 1 through level 3 support, and have really seen a lot of ways. I've really seen the evolution of software development into where we're seeing with DevOps today. So really what I want to cover with myself and Tracy is how we can leverage an automated process with software delivery into a tool with OpenMake as well. There's a lot that we can cover in this conversation, but really what I want to drive home today is the spirit of collaboration among software developers and using tools like OpenMake to automate the delivery process as quickly as possible. So with that, I want to go ahead and have maybe Tracy introduce herself, and then we'll go ahead and get into the discussion.
Thank you. I'm Tracy Ragan, CEO of OpenMake Software. What we're talking about today will be a product that is now known as DeployHub, and its specialty is being driven by the CD process to do continuous deployments. We often hear that continuous deployment is the sort of the unicorn. Well, we think that you can leash the unicorn and put it to work for you, and that's what continuous deployment's all about. We'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges, but I want everybody to understand that application release automation does not have to be expensive. DeployHub is open source, so what we're going to show you today, you can actually get started with at no cost to you. And Christian, I'll turn it back to you.
Perfect. And for those on the webinar, Tracy will be my guide with the slides. So you may hear me say next slide. So that's what that is. So as Tracy was talking about, essentially what we're thinking about here is software development from two sides, right? We're thinking about release automation and release management, but we're also thinking about GitHub as a software development platform that can sort of link this whole process together. So when we think about traditional software development life cycles, one of the last pieces that's really to be solved in this process is the idea of how we can sort of manage continuous deployment. We've done a really great job of managing a software development pipeline up until the continuous integration point. But up until now, there really hasn't been a lot of great tools that really can handle sort of release management and sort of the next step from there as well. So when we talk about teams that want to be agile or they want to sort of accelerate the release cycles, essentially we need an end-to-end pipeline that can get us all the way from development to production. And so when we think about that tooling, what that will enable us to do is to bring us into a cycle of innovation. Tracy, next slide. Perfect. And what I mean by that is we need to get into a mindset where we are moving away from ideas like long-running branches and long-running releases and get into more of an iterative approach regarding our software development practice. And what I mean by that is that our change sets need to become smaller and smaller because when we do something like that, then we can actually start making more rapid changes to our product. Just as an aside, we do this internally at GitHub, and this allows us to release to production 15 to 20 times a day to github.com. And the way we do that is through this sort of process that you see on the screen. So as we're walking through this, I'm going to focus more on the GitHub side of this, which is our sort of continuous integration into our code. And then you'll see on the right-hand side that we're actually moving into DeployHub to manage our shipped code as well. This sort of cycle, again, produces innovation and produces a more empowered developer. Because what we're really trying to do at GitHub is we're trying to change the context of how software development is done. Tracy, next slide. And what I mean by changing the context of the conversation is that we want to build more communities within software development organizations to change that context. When we think about traditional software development practices, a lot of times traditional software shops have written software in silos. They've written very regimented, very isolated pieces of software that may relate to a bigger picture, but a lot of times software development teams and organizations are not necessarily on board with, are not necessarily given the information as to what the bigger picture is. So when we think about a platform like GitHub to enable that, I think one of our case studies with one of our enterprise customers, SAP, really shows that. What we're doing is we're breaking down internal silos within software development organizations. We're increasing transparency. And with this whole process where we move into a shift left mentality, we are now exposing all of that, all of those changes within the scope of that organization to all those developers. This again kind of moves into a concept of what we like to call inner sourcing within organizations, in that we take the practices and methodologies that have enabled the open source software development community to succeed with large distributed projects and start applying that behind our firewall. So what I mean by that is that we do things like move into a method of being open by default, meaning that if I'm a member of an organization within my GitHub instance, unless there are specific legal or compliance reasons that prevent me seeing that code, repository should be open for everyone to innovate and work on from there as well. Tracy, next slide. Because when we start doing that in terms of building that transparency and that visibility into that pipeline, what we can see through independent study is that this actually reduces developer churn and increases visibility. So I'm not sure if a lot of you are familiar with Git Prime, but essentially they are a Git-based research organization that does a lot of metrics and a lot of software based on Git itself. And they found that developers that have gone to GitHub from other legacy systems, on average, reduce code churn by at least 12%, depending on the organization. So we can already see that from a metric standpoint, there's already a tangible benefit by developers moving into this mindset. And when we start reducing that amount of churn, we do two things. One, we reduce the amount of work that a developer has to do. And we're also decreasing code deduplication as well. I can tell you firsthand that in a previous life when I worked at a financial services firm, you know, one of the biggest challenges that we had as our own organization was really that code deduplication effort, because we had a lot of isolated teams that didn't necessarily know what everyone was working on. And there were at least 2 projects that I worked on personally where had I known what the rest of the organization was working on, we would have been able to increase that as well. So now I want to kind of maybe shift the conversation a little bit and kind of show you what this actually looks like on our platform, because when we talk about the platform, we're not necessarily focusing on individual features, right? We believe that the GitHub platform, based on all the small things that make up it, really accelerates software developers to work better together. So when I talk about that, it's things like our issues, right? Our lightweight issue tracker that allows developers to increase visibility. They don't have to necessarily switch context into other platforms. They have everything right here. And Tracy, if I could have you hit the next slide. or the next transition. Yeah. So things like guidelines, right? When we think about legacy version control tools, you don't necessarily have like a really nice platform that kind of gives you, that helps you sort of lead the way and lead breadcrumbs on how you want to do this. So one of the most important, I think, things I think when we're looking at the scope of a repository on GitHub is the guidelines and the contributing guidelines that developers and users of that repository can see from there as well. Next slide. Other little things like labeling that allows us to tag those to milestones, which then we can cut from releases, really allow developers to not only organize efficiently, but also allows new developers to really organize and see what they can contribute on. A very common use case with developers that are using GitHub for the first time is that they'll go into a repository organized by the labels and look for labels like easy to fix or first time contributor, because they can see what kind of issues that they can fix on there as well. Tracy, next slide. And then we move into the idea of the pull request. Now, one of the most important things that I think when we think about the pull request is that we're, putting version control on all of our code. But the second thing that the pull request does is it encourages and exposes collaboration across the entire team. So this is an actual pull request that's on the GitHub/GitHub that is currently open. So we're fixing a nice little bug within one of the PR edit titles. And you can see that we have developers that are collaborating on the code as close to the code as possible. Because when we think about traditional software development, a lot of times our change requests and our conversations around our code are happening in disparate, disconnected systems that don't necessarily allow for the context to be shown in the future. So if I was to look at this PR 6 months from now, because I have that conversation right there, I can certainly understand the context of maybe why this code was changed or how it evolved over time. The second part of this, and going into where Tracy's going to take over, is the security and the continuous integration that's built into this process as well. So even if I have an approved pull request, as I have right here, and all of my CI has passed, we build this all into our pull request, and we can certainly allow for any level of granularity on there as well. Tracy, next slide. Because then we're also going to build in the idea of code security. So even if all of our CI checks pass, and all of our collaboration, all of our approvers have approved it, we can still do things like code security to prevent code from being merged until we're absolutely ready. And I think that really ties into this whole process and how we want to build an automated pipeline, and then integrating into tools like OpenMake and DeployHub that will integrate this process and accelerate it even further. We at GitHub know that we do one thing really well, which is, or two things really well. It's source code management and code collaboration. We then work with our integration partners like DeployHub that can really take this to the next step. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Tracy, who's going to lead the rest of the conversation today.
Yeah, Tracy, this is Parker. Let me interrupt you for 1 second. Everyone, just to let you know, we're going to have a question and answer period at the end. And this webinar will be available for viewing on devops.com after the webinar if you choose to view it again. Tracy, it's all yours.
Okay, Deb, we have our first polling question.
45% of Fortune 100 companies use GitHub Enterprise. Are you a GitHub Enterprise user?
Yeah, I think this was one of the most interesting things I learned when I joined GitHub. When I first joined GitHub about 2.5 years ago, while everyone's polling, I didn't even realize we had an enterprise on-prem product. And as it's evolved, it's really great to see all of these, all of our users that use on-prem as well. So it looks like we've got a good mix. 61% are not GitHub Enterprise users, but 39% are. So that almost matches where we're at in the Fortune 100 as well.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to continue this conversation on from where Christian left off. We're going to talk a little bit about the pipeline and where most of you may be. Some of you maybe have a more mature pipeline, but for the most part, what we see is a process where you have some level of workflows, maybe ran by Jenkins or even built into GitHub, whereby you have a process for dev, a process for a testing environment, and hopefully you can get it to production. And what we see oftentimes is there's a lot of automation being built around the pipeline, but when it comes to the package and deploy process, it's scripted. And for good reason, because these tools can be extremely pricey and way over a project team's budget. But what that eventually will do is create a barrier to getting to production, because scripted deployments can be a bit tricky to manage across the pipeline. They have to adapt, they have to change on the based on the environment, and that's really what release automation solutions are intended to do. Again, what we see as the barrier to getting there is the cost of these tools. And so what happens is each environment scripts their own process. And sometimes dev will script for QA, but for the most part, it gets staged. And the production team makes a decision at some later point when that code gets moved all the way to the prod state. It's not necessarily automated or pushed in a continuous delivery fashion. Part of the reason, too, is a trust factor. Production teams like to write their own scripts, just as developers like to write their own scripts, and sometimes testing. So what occurs is that a production team looks at the development code as something they can't maintain, and so they choose to write their own. So there's a trust issue in the overall process. And what we're really trying to get to is a mature loop, one that information can be shared across the pipeline. And as Christian pointed out, we want to shift left. So more of the responsibility for doing deployments need to be in the hands of the developers, because quite honestly, it's the developers who know the most about their application, and they have the most to lose if something goes wrong. And in reality, for years now, we have had developers helping production teams get their production scripts to work. So we really are trying to build a loop. And we're going to show you basically today how you can do that. So let's just get another poll here. How mature is your continuous delivery model? Are you in one of these categories where each environment owner scripts their own deployment practice, or where you're a CI/CD manages scripted deployments from dev to test? And the third option is, are you using a full release automation solution? Deb, I'll let you go ahead and open that poll. I don't know why it does that.
Results are in.
Okay, I can't see them. Deb, is there anything interesting there you want to talk about?
44% say each environment owner scripts their own deployment process, followed closely at 31% with CI/CD manages scripted deployments, and 25% use an integrated application release automation system.
So some of you have matured up to that highest level, which is where most companies are trying to get to. And several of us are still back there doing what we can with the CI/CD process. So I think that you'll see that automating these pieces, continuous deployment, is as critical as automating continuous build and continuous test. So we're going to look at, are you guys still able to see my screen? Is it advancing?
Yep, it's advancing.
Okay. Thank you. So the tools you're going to need, we're going to show you how to use the GitHub repository for the issue tracking and keeping track of the artifacts to be deployed, and DeployHub for doing the release packaging and the actual release process. We're going to keep it down to 2 simple steps. The first step, what you do is you create a DeployHub application package using components. Now, in the DeployHub world, a application is made up of multiple components. Those components are mapped to the GitHub repository at the artifact level and at the issue level. So you're mapping first your assets, your GitHub release assets to a DeployHub component. So that makes your first connection. The second step you're going to do is create a pipeline project. So you're going to use your GitHub project to control the deployments across the pipeline, but you're going to package the deployment in a DeployHub application. So for example, a DeployHub application package might contain two components, a Tomcat web app runner and an uptime war file. Now, you could include also other parts of that application, like the database, for example. If you had database changes, that would be a component. If you need to install Tomcat, you could actually call on Ansible, or which we integrate with, or Puppet to actually, or Chef to install Tomcat. And what the pipeline project will do is help manage the approvals for the deployments. It'll record a full audit history, so you have the ability to have a loop and have visibility for your production teams. It'll consolidate all these deployment activities so they're in one place and they're actually versioned. And they're going to link deployment components back to a change request. And what that's going to do is give us a full loop so that everybody can stay in the loop, so to speak. Now, the results will be the wiki issues are going to be linked to your deployments. So you'll be able to go into your actual issue, and you'll be able to see if it's been deployed and where it's been deployed to. And all that information is hyperlinked for easy viewing. So you can actually look at a change request and determine what deployment that change request was a part of, and be able to drive down and actually see where that deployment might have been and how far across the pipeline it got to. So what you're ending up with is a full loop, starting with being able to create those GitHub webhooks that tells DeployHub to check the approval status and records any corresponding approval in DeployHub. It's going to go down through that the approval process. So DeployHub would move a package, the application package with all those components, from a development environment into a test environment, execute that deployment with any post action. For example, you might have a post action to run test automation, and then notify everybody on success, in particular production. At that point, production can approve it and move the package up to the production state, execute the production, and execute any post action. And we have customers who oftentimes like to do a smoke test in production. Now, keep in mind that for most of this, it can be managed by the development team or your site reliability engineer. The whole idea of shifting left means that developers have a tool that production and testing teams can have visibility into and have some control if they need to. And that's what the DeployHub GitHub combination offers. So again, what we end up with is with GitHub and DeployHub having all the information in them. So you can go to that wiki page and centralize what that continuous loop look like, from the initial approval and the check-in all the way to the production deployment. And all the actions are recorded in both locations, the DeployHub actions, the build logs, the test results, and all the change requests. On the DeployHub side, you're going to get a full continuous feedback loop as well, which shows you all the way back to the source and the git commit, what build job, if you're using a CI server like Jenkins, you might bring a build job forward, the issue number associated to the application components, the application package, all the way to the environment and the endpoints in the environment. So now you actually have the ability to say, I know I committed my code, I know we did a build, but did it ever get to production? And this provides that full loop. Now, the loop's not just important to developers, it's important to the production teams, because what the production teams want is not necessarily the responsibility of doing the deployments. What they want is the information and the visibility into what's occurring. And they also want some level of control. We're not talking about it today, but calendars can provide them additional security and control around the process, but we're really talking about the open source version. And in the open source version, the production team has the full visibility into what they need to know about that release that went forward. Back inside, if we go back to the GitHub wiki, we can see all the feedback loop logs. So you can see everything that occurred for that entire process, from the beginning of the pipeline all the way back to the beginning of the pipeline when the changes are done again. So just a couple of points. What we used webhooks for triggering events. We used what we call releases for managing artifacts. We use the GitHub Wiki for documentation. We use the GitHub Enterprise security model for locking down who can do what, and for auditing of who did what and when. On the DeployHub side, we deployed by those events. We used application packaging for components. We used what we have internally in our continuous deployment pipeline, and we used some pre and post deployment actions. We used the Git repo for pulling the artifacts, and we did our own versioning control in that process. So since some of you may not know what DeployHub is, it's an agentless continuous deployment solution. It has an open source base to it that can do what we just talked about. Why it's important is because it allows developers to declare their configurations of their application package, including database and infrastructure. And it also allows the application package to be pushed or pulled, so you can have a push methodology as you would in a continuous delivery, or an on-demand pull if you chose to do that. And it can track to any kind of target, physical, containers, virtual. This topic is going to become more and more important as we go to microservices and what's running on a microservice. And it has an agentless architecture, so it's super easy to install and implement, and it doesn't impact it's non-invasive when it comes to the production environment. You're not having to ask your production team to install agents in order to make it work. Another important part that, as a selling point as a developer to get this moving forward to the production team is it does have a back-end version control database, not to version the code coming out of GitHub, of course, but to version the package itself. So once you declare your package all the way down to the logic required to do the install for any particular component, or an update to a environment variable, or a change to a Cisco request router, all of that stuff is kept in one package, and any changes made to it, no matter how small, is recorded. Personally, I think it's the most interesting part of our product because it does provide the ability to do version jumping. So for example, if you've got production is back 6 or 7 versions and you need to get them up to speed, up to the most recent version, it's going to do that for you, but it's going to do it incrementally, even pulling all of the database pieces and any of the environment variable pieces along with it. As I said, you don't have to go out and get budget authority for using DeployHub to do your continuous deployments. We saw that there was a gap in the open source tooling for doing continuous delivery and continuous deployment, so we stuffed that with DeployHub. It competes extremely well against the big players, and we have been recognized in the Gartner Magic Quadrants 2 years in a row, and we continue to move to the east and to the north, which is the direction you want to go. And if you want more information, you can join the community. You can go to deployhub.org, and there is a full demo of what we just talked about, and you can find that at openmakesoftware.com. And on that note, I think I will leave it open for questions.
Yeah, Tracy, I'm back. I'm sorry, I have to apologize, but I had some mic problems. But
That's okay.
So I sort of left you hang, and Deb picked up the poll question, so thank you, Deb. But anyway, we have some questions, and let's start, because we have a lot of time, so this is going to be real interesting. We can dig into this. How does the whole process, how do you start it? How do you kick it off? What's the best way to go about this, Tracy?
I'm going to leave that one for Christian.
So there's that's a really good question. So there's a couple of ways that we can approach this, right? I'll talk about the more traditionally sort of thought about way in terms of how you can sort of kick off an automated pipeline, and I'll move into sort of the GitHub recommended way, and then the way we do it actually as well. So the most common way that when we think about these like pipelines is we tend to think of it in like a polling situation, right? I have a canonical source code management server. It can be Git, it can be Subversion, it can be ClearCase. And traditionally what most organizations I've seen done, what I've seen in my experience is before they even think about modernizing, they tend to have a build process that will then query the source code server for changes, right? this becomes very inefficient, because then essentially what happens is you start scheduling everything, and you're sort of dependent on that scheduling to have your builds happen. In this process, and what Tracy and I have shown, and how we actually do our internal builds at GitHub as well, is everything is API and webhook driven, meaning that in the scope of our pull request, or it can even be as granular as the individual commit, we're actually kicking off builds every time somebody commits to the repository. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do that, but with the flexibility of our webhook platform, you can trigger events very commonly. So like, for example, when we're getting ready to do a deployment internally at GitHub, we have like a series of about 20 checks that go through, and they do that individually per commit to make sure that everything is up and running. Tracy, in your experience, what have you seen, and how do you guys recommend?
Well, there's a point in the life of continuous delivery that we become important. So for the most part, what we see is that the customer has gone through what you've just described, and they believe that they are at a point in a maturity level across the organization that they're really ready to start mastering what I call Agile's last mile, which is getting things all the way to production. Once that occurs, the next step is to really start defining the application packaging process. It's important to get the application packaging down, because that's what you want to be able to version, and it needs to have some automation behind it. So once they've gotten to a certain level of maturity in their continuous delivery, and they're probably doing continuous build, and they're doing check-in and compile, which is continuous integration, and they're doing the automated builds, and they're starting to do automated tests, the continuous deployment question becomes important. And at that point, you have to decide what's going to drive it. In the demo that we just examples we just provided, GitHub would be driving the process, but you could also drive it with something like a Jenkins CI process, or Bamboo, or any common CI server that you might have.
Yeah, and then one thing I wanted to note, because I think this is something that I always hear in terms of objections from software development organizations that are coming from legacy tooling or legacy processes. A lot of times, a lot of customers will see this sort of process, like something like GitHub and OpenMake, and we always do a lot of demonstrations around web applications, or like Tomcat servers, or like even GitHub, where I like to describe we're a Ruby on Rails app on absolute steroids, right? So a lot of times, a lot of organizations will get it in the mindset that they think this is only for like web application development or modern software development technologies. And the answer, my rebuttal to that is, we've seen, not only are these tools agnostic, but we've seen successes in just about any sort of industry, in any vertical. So, I think a really good example of this is BMW is one of our enterprise customers based out of Germany. And I think we all know who BMW is. They've got great cars. They started their GitHub Enterprise journey because of the lack of great software that was built around their in-dash entertainment systems. So they evolved onto that, and then they've eventually moved their enterprise software delivery practice with GitHub and other tools into GitHub itself. So now they're doing all of their embedded development, and everything around every other piece of the car is actually being done in that process. So it's really about finding, like, not only migrating your SCM tools, but it's also about fitting your build tools and your delivery tools into this process as well. And I would say it's not impossible. I've seen a lot of success with it. So,
wow, thank you very much to both. You had quite the answer. Another question. I assume this for you, Chris. How can you manage a database as a part of this process?
So that's a.
I'll take that.
Tracy.
Yeah, I'll take
Tracy,
that.
you'll take it. I'm batting at zero here. I'm trying to go.
It's okay. That's okay. So on the database side, we get that question a lot. A database is just another component in the mind of DeployHub. So we talked about what an application is. An application is a collection of components. And when you define your application package, you would define let's say a PSQL statement as one of your components. And that SQL statement might add a table, for example, to roll forward, or it might delete that table on a rollback. So when you're managing database components, you're actually adding them as a component to the application package, and that component has an activity associated to it that actually does what that component needs. And that's how we do it. And so it just becomes another part of the application package. It can move forward or move back or be checked into the backend version control database to be checked out and applied at some future date in a version jump, forward or back.
Okay, thanks. Now I'm not even going to guess this time. How do I know when the issue has been closed and what environment it has been installed to?
I think I'll give that to Christian.
And I was going to pick him.
It's an issue, right?
It's an issue, right? So what we're doing, with what Tracy showed and what we sort of have is an extensible platform that can sort of set up the granularity and the level of reporting that you want. So in Tracy's example, all of the issues are being linked back in a wiki referencing the issue that it's coming from. So the way that we key that up is based on the SHA commit number that we're building or releasing off of. So Tracy takes that information from our webhooks and essentially takes that JSON payload and will then report back to the wiki. Now, the nice thing about that is because of those webhooks and the amount of information that we give you, it doesn't just stop at maybe putting it in the wiki. It's really up to you on how you want to build this process. So if you want to be super automated, a very common use case would be once I have a deployment out, then I can essentially via the API close out an issue or merge a pull request back into master if I want to as well. I would highly suggest for the person who asked this question to take a look at our API and see how flexible it is and the amount of data that it will give back to you, because the world is essentially your oyster with this in terms of what you can do in terms of building automation. I've seen a lot of organizations go automated all the way to QA, but still want to have a manual workflow from UAT to production. But I've also seen like what we do at GitHub, we're fully automated all the way to production as well. And it's because of our API and our webhooks that really allow for that flexibility and that freedom for your organization to make the choice on how much automation that you want in there as well. And the DeployHub allows you that freedom or that safety net to be automated, but still have an application and a platform like DeployHub to give you that safety and security at the same time.
Yeah, so I'll just, emphasize that what's happening is that you have these application components, and those components are associated back to GitHub through change requests or issue number. And that's associated back to your commit and your source. So we're using those webhooks to complete that picture, because we have what we would call the backstream information, and GitHub has the front stream information. And we're pulling that together through those webhooks.
Yep. And we and for those unfamiliar with Git, and I'll just add like 15 seconds on this. For those unfamiliar with Git, we are not, like, Git itself is not like a time-based or a file-based version control system. It all goes back to what we call the SHA string. So every commit essentially is encoded into a non-linear string, and that's how we're providing all that traceability and all that feedback back to the Git server from DeployHub. Yep.
Great, thanks. We've been getting a lot of questions. There's apparently been some issues with viewing the slides. Understand all the slides will be available on devops.com, sometime after the webinar within 24 hours. So you'll be able to get everything if you missed everything. I'm gonna take a shot today. This is Tracy. What platforms are supported?
Well, both GitHub and DeployHub are platform agnostic. So if you wanted to support, in terms of doing deployments, because there's no agent required, we can deploy to just about any environment, including, heaven forbid, yes, the mainframe, iSeries, and like I said earlier, even a Cisco request router if you needed to. And on the GitHub side, it's agnostic to platform. So you can, these are what I would consider true enterprise tools, that they're not built for a particular tool. They're built for the enterprise and what the enterprise might run into in terms of platforms and different languages and environments that they're working in.
Yeah, for GitHub itself, we tend to, we have a very we have an opinion on how software should be done in terms of workflow. You know, we talk about Git flow and GitHub flow, but ultimately it's up to the enterprise organization to take that opinion and see if it, you know, gels with how they're currently doing work. And if it doesn't, GitHub itself is flexible enough to meet any sort of workflow requirement.
And now really taking off on that question a little bit, do you integrate with Atlassian, Jira, and Confluence?
Absolutely,
Yes.
100%.
I knew the answer, but I wanted to be clear for him.
Yeah,
you know?
neither side cares. So again, those tools, keep in mind, continuous integration tools like Jenkins and Bamboo, they themselves don't do anything, but they orchestrate. So they don't do compiles, and they don't do deployments, and they don't do version control, and they don't do testing, but they are a central point of control to run a workflow that may call all of those tools.
Yep.
And there is oftentimes a confusion about DeployHub competing with Jenkins, and I want to kill that immediately. Because Jenkins is not ever going to want to try to manage a application package. It's going to call other tools to do that. And what most people do is they write their own deployment process, and then you hear, well, Jenkins is doing my deployments. Well, not really. Some unsung hero who wrote that script is actually doing your deployments. So yes, these tools fit within any of your CI/CD processes from the beginning to the end of what you saw today. You could have that driven by any of the CI tools.
Yep, and then I will say from the GitHub side, GitHub and Jira is probably the most common integration that I see outside of GitHub and Jenkins, right? There are support for smart commits. You can do transitions. You can do time-based tracking, and it's all built on the commit mapping that you'll set up on the Jira side. And that plugin is available in the marketplace. It has full support for GitHub and GitHub Enterprise. And then there is a Confluence plugin as well. So if you're already invested in the Atlassian ecosystem a bit, hopefully you're not using BitBucket. That's okay if you are. Then there is support for that as well. So, yep.
Okay, Chris, I have one for you. What's the difference between GitHub and BitBucket?
Ooh, that's a great question. So,
I know.
So it's actually, that's a good question. How do I want to take that? Because I've got like 12 different answers, right? So do we have 3 hours? Because I could certainly talk your head.
Yeah, we got a little time. Pick
All
three.
right. So I think I want to elevate the conversation a little bit. So in terms of what we think about in terms of source code management, GitHub and BitBucket are very similar, right? So BitBucket is a source code management utility that was originally written on Mercurial when it was stashed, but now it's Git-based as it's now known as BitBucket. But I think, you know, in terms of where you see the core differentiator is when you look at BitBucket in terms of its UI and its UX, and I highly encourage you to take a look at this if you've never seen it before. We always want you to check out our competitors because we're usually a little bit better. Atlassian tends to take the bigger project focus, right? They want to get everybody involved in the process, and they've really designed their UX with BitBucket around sort of the project manager level. So if you look at how you navigate and how your pull requests look in GitHub, it's really designed for the project manager to have visibility into that process. If you look at GitHub, we take a developer first, best of breed approach that is not necessarily designed around one ecosystem or one platform, and is really centered on the developer experience. There's something internally that we talk about. One of our design philosophies when it comes to actually developing our platform is this idea around developer happiness, or what we call what we'd like to call developer love as well. And I know that sounds a little hippie, a little bit, but it's really about knowing that developers work really well when they have tools that really that kind of get out of their way, right? Developers, when they're using GitHub, don't really have to think about the tool. It's just something that's there, and there are all these little things that sort of add up that build efficiency. One of the most common, some of the most common feedback that I get from developers on BitBucket is that it looks like Jira, and it feels like Jira, and it's used like Jira. There are complex permissioning models. The servers themselves are not very performant, and even some of the feedback that I've received from my customers when they've worked with Atlassian is that they feel Atlassian's just not investing a whole lot into the platform. BitBucket being an SCM tool that they have, but their big investment is in more what they consider enterprise grade tools like Jira and Confluence. So GitHub is our product. It's what we go to market with, and we put 100% of our effort into it. So that's sort of my take on it.
Okay, let's keep going. There's some great questions here. How do you handle deployment failures?
I'll
Great
take that
question.
one.
Yeah, go for it, Tracy.
I'll take that one. So deployment failures are a bummer. They happen. Much of the reasons why they happen is because there's scripts back there that's doing work, and it's hard to see what occurred. So in DeployHub, you have some options. You can continue moving forward, which is sort of a habit that I've gotten into in the continuous integration world, or you can jump forward or back. So you can do an immediate rollback should you need to, even if that means you have to bring in environment variables and database updates. And you can, or you can jump it forward. So you can apply a fix and then jump it forward. Now, keep in mind that the difference between when you have an automation tool and a scripted environment is that there's some visibility into the process, and you can see what's changed between those two deployments. So if you are trying to sort out why your deployment failed, you can quickly look to see what was changed from the last time, and you know probably that's what caused the problem. So you can actually apply the fix and then move that forward, because now once you've applied the fix, you have a new version and you push that new version forward, or you can just do a rollback. Either way is available. And I really want to emphasize, because we have that backend version control engine that treats the entire application package like code. And it packages everything, it versions the entire package, knowing everything that occurred to that package. It makes it super easy to make a fix or to roll back.
Yep. And then from our side, from the SCM side, it starts with branch protections, right? So essentially, when we're opening up pull requests, we need to be, by default, 100% of the time, I always recommend that you start protecting your master branch as a branch that should not have force pushing, and then doubling down on that with things like required statuses and branch permissioning that not only control who can merge to a branch, but also if your deployment fails, OpenMake can send a signal back to GitHub that says, hey, this failed. Perhaps we should block this pull request from being merged back into master until we figure out what's happening, right? Yeah.
Okay, since we're on deployment, let me take off with another question. How does Kubernetes fit into your deployment process?
I love that question, because the more we get into these containers and microservice environments, the more important it's going to be to start automating the application package management. So Kubernetes is treated just like anything else. So we treat containers in the same way as we treat any endpoint. Keep in mind, we don't have to have an agent out there, so that an agent isn't required to be on your container prior to doing a deployment. The other thing that we do is, because we have that backend version control piece, we can determine where versions of components are installed in what containers. So the farther down the road you go into the Kubernetes world and you start using microservices, you're gonna explode your number of endpoints. Literally, it's gonna explode. And keeping track of who's actually running one of those, a particular microservice, who's actually using it, if you have people connecting to it, all of that information is going to begin becoming more and more important. And in our future roadmap, we're going to start building out those kinds of features, because we already know what component is going to be installed on what microservice. And what we should be able to do as well is to provide to you if anybody's using that microservice. So the Kubernetes environment is going to be extremely important as we move forward, and we already do support the containers. We just joined the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, so that we can have closer conversations with the Kubernetes folks, and we will be looking at integrating into Helm. So Helm is a Kubernetes point A to point B deployment solution, and it uses something called charts. And what we will be able to do is potentially generate those charts with our application packaging, so that you have all of that information ready to be pushed out by Helm. So we're very excited about Kubernetes. We currently support containers, and we're going to be building more features around management of microservices from who's using what.
Yep. And then I would say to add on to that, because like Tracy said, it's all just being treated as code. Essentially, you can take two strategies around the sort of composition and the deployment of those orchestrators, right? You can, the most common way and probably the most useful way is you treat those, you basically have those composition files, those orchestration files live within your project. So if you have a repository, many times you'll have either like a .compose folder or a .github folder that takes all of those like infrastructure and composition specific files and you put it in its own isolated environment. Or less commonly, but also equally useful, is having a separate project that controls all of that orchestration, and then using a webhook to sort of manage all of that flow as well. It's just depending on how you want to organize it. The most common I see though, and especially if you want to get into a sort of a microservices first approach, is keeping it at the repository level. Yep.
That's great. Let's take it to a little something here. For somebody had a question regarding Microsoft. How well does this solution work with Microsoft MVC servers?
What kind of server? I'm sorry.
MVC.
Oh, like a model view controller, like a
Yeah.
.NET sort of.
NIS kind of stuff.
Yeah, 100%. Our partnership with Microsoft is only strengthening day by day. So not only can you sort of deploy any sort of MVC framework application, I mean, that's what Ruby on Rails is. These work very seamlessly. I think, Microsoft, especially with our relationship with them as it's evolved, they are getting more and more focused on not only the open source, but on the modern platform as well. So we've had a chance to talk extensively with Microsoft, and some of the stuff that they're working on that you'll see later, probably in this coming year and the next, I think is going to be very exciting, and it's only going to tighten that integration in terms of supporting the entire Microsoft platform. They've put a lot of money and investment into Azure, and I think you'll see a lot of that. But if you're using other like on-prem tools like IIS to deploy your .NET applications, today there's 100% support for that. Yep.
And that's on both sides. It's on the DeployHub side as well. DeployHub it fully supports the Windows environment.
Yep.
That's great. I got a few more. Do you support Haskell and CI for Nix projects?
Haskell
and yeah. So Haskell being, I'm going to assume it's we're referring to Haskell as sort of the functional programming language.
That's the only one I'm aware of.
That's the one I'm aware of as well. So yeah, I didn't hear the CI part of that question, but I'll take it to my Haskell.
Well, just say, do you support Haskell and CI for Nix projects? NIX. I mean,
like StarNix, yeah, absolutely. That's probably where Git sort of got its start was in when Linus wrote it. It was more a tool geared and optimized for at that time for the Nix community, right? So yeah, 100%. Managed to.
And that's really, I mean, I think we've covered all the questions except for a couple. Maybe if I'd asked your question, I feel it was answered by seeing another question. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank Tracy and Chris. And if you want to learn more about this, go to openmakesoftware.com. Tracy, do you have any closing comments?
No, I don't think so. I just want to thank Chris and GitHub for doing this webinar with us. It's been great to work with the team.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for putting up with our little technical difficulties throughout this webinar, but I see most of you stayed on, so we really appreciate it. And thank you for attending another webinar, and have a good rest of your day or evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.